than wrecks our water quality.
Yeah.
I'm grateful to speak in part in my capacity as chairman of Your Lordship's Built Environment Select Committee, to which the noble Lord Best referred, explaining that we have in fact, perhaps coincidentally, spent the last 6 months taking evidence, not so-called evidence, I might say, but actual evidence, on precisely this topic, on a broader range. I mean, the subject of our inquiry has been the interaction between environmental regulations and development, but inevitably this question of nutrient neutrality has occupied an important place in it because it is so important and so live. And the noble Lord Best, has explained that the report is not yet published. It is actually practically at the printer, and we hope that it will appear next week. And so we're not here in a position to quote from it. But I see a number of members of the committee in the chamber, and I hope very much that they will speak, because we've been very struck by what we have found. Now, a great deal of what we have found has been explained by the noble Lord Best, and I don't propose to repeat all of that. I shall speak more briefly. But I do want to draw attention to one conclusion that we reached without any dissent, and that is that when new environmental legislation is introduced, which is well thought out, which is consulted on, and which is given adequate time for implementation, it is normally absorbed, adopted and implemented by the house building industry with no disruption or difficulty at all. That is the right way for us to make environmental legislation. It is what we normally do. But in this case, that isn't what has happened at all. The root of this problem is that a European Court of Justice decision in 2018 in a case related to Dutch farming, which, as we all know, is probably the most intense farming in the world, and the consequences it had in the Netherlands for runoff into watercourses, that judgment created a more restrictive interpretation of the existing habitat regulations than had been agreed or understood before. And Natural England, because, of course, we were still part of the European Union, but of course I shan't go into the European consequences of all of this, but Natural England rightly understood that this judgment had an effect in England as well. And so they took legal advice as to what consequences it had for them. And then they went off and they discussed it with DEFRA. And DEFRA took legal advice, which more or less, as far as I haven't seen the legal advice, but appears to have concurred with that which Natural England had obtained. And DEFRA, our committee still doesn't quite understand why DEFRA insisted still at this stage that nobody should be allowed to discuss this, and that it all had to be kept very secret between them and Natural England. And the result was that when they announced what the consequences were, as they understood it, of this new decision, there was no warning whatsoever. There was none of that normal consensus, that building of consultation, that buying in, that time for implementation. All of a sudden it appeared that in a number of catchment areas, covering, I believe, approximately 14% of the land area of England, and it's absolutely true, hasn't stopped house building in every part of England, but roughly 14% of the land area of England, in effect, overnight there is a moratorium even on the completion of sites which already had planning permission. And this is utterly disruptive and completely unplanned, and in my view is the evidence and the argument for treating this particular circumstance as a special case in which the government, I think, needs to take steps to sort this out, untangle ourselves, and make a plan which allows us to deliver all of our objectives, our house building objectives and our environmental objectives, over time. And that is why I support this package. It does involve a few optical devices, but they achieve the effect. What it effectively says is that you can carry on building housing that we desperately need. You can carry on building local housing, affordable housing, student accommodation. All of these are caught by the ban. You can carry on doing that, but there will also be additional measures to mitigate matters. There will be more money, there will be bigger effort put into addressing the pollution in our watercourses. And I think that is the sort of balance that we need to achieve if we're not to be paralysed completely. And as I say, there is a very strong reason for thinking of it as a special case. On the question of how big a contributor house building is, I just note, and I haven't, of course, done the extensive research done by the Noble Baroness Lady Willis, but I've simply looked up on Google. There are 26.5 million dwellings in England and Wales. The number of new houses we build each year, the government target, of course, is 300,000. We don't get close to 300,000. We're very lucky if we hit 250,000. That is 1% of the existing stock. Even if all of the nutrient problems in our watercourses came from housing, that would still be, new house building would still be a very, very small fraction of what we are discussing. It would be less than 1%. But we know that it doesn't all come from housing. We know that a great deal of it comes from poor agricultural practice built up over years, from piggeries, from chicken farms that are not properly managed. We know that it comes from sewage works that are inadequate to the flows, the combined flows of water and sewage which they are expected to take. And so when you take that into account, it isn't even 1%, it is a fraction of 1%. And it is something which I think we just need to keep in proportion and not be excessively hysterical about. As I say, it's a matter of great regret that this debate is taking place before the Select Committee report appears next week. I do encourage noble lords to read it when it appears, and I think they'll find a great deal of evidence in it that is relevant to what we are discussing today.
Chair.